Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and if you watched last week's video and thought to yourself, I wonder if Bo's going to take a look at Shadowhawk number 1 after seeing those two Shadowhawk ads in Spawn number 3. Well, wonder no more, because we are talking about Shadowhawk number 1. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. Before we get started, I'd like to point out that Shadowhawk number 1 has two separate covers. The cover that we're looking at currently is the newsstand cover. It's not that it's terribly different from the comic book retailer cover. We can see here that there is a barcode present, which is exclusive to the newsstand cover. The bottom section of Shadowhawk's face is silver. The words "Who is" are also silver. And we notice that in the top left-hand corner where the dot of the image eye is, that it has the number 1, but does not have the month, which was August of 1992 that this comic was first released. I'd also like to point out that the newsstand cover was cheaper, and that's because the comic book retailer cover looked like this. As you can see, the comic book retailer cover is all chromed out in all of its chromium glory. This comic is $2.50, whereas the newsstand version was $1.95, which I understand the chromium covers did cost more to produce. But on the upside, as of the making of this video, this book has now appreciated to a total of $5 on the open market, which means that it's appreciated at an average of 8 cents per year for the last 30 years. That's a return on investment, folks. Created, written, and illustrated by Jim Valentino. Letters, Diane Valentino. Colors, Digital Chameleon. Editor, Eric Stevenson. New York consultants, Leslie and Adam, whose last names apparently didn't matter. We can see here that the book starts out in Soho, New York, and is in a pretty bad part of town. We see 3 street toughs on a stoop up to no good when they notice a homeless man walking down the street, who they of course decide to assault because they were bored and he was around. We see one of the toughs pulls a knife, but they're in for a little bit of a surprise. The surprise, of course, is that the homeless man was actually Shadowhawk in disguise, and he quickly starts to make short work of the 3 street toughs. As they come at him from all sides, he has no trouble dispatching them. They're clearly outmatched. The first one is taken down pretty quickly. The third one makes a run for it, and the second one starts to get up, but is then met by a backhand. And then, oh my gosh, Shadowhawk decides to snap his spine in half, paralyzing this guy for the rest of his life. On the next page, we see that shortly after the encounter, the New York Police Department has shown up to the scene of the crime. And this is not something that they haven't seen before. They've been hot on the tail of Shadowhawk for the past 3 months. We see here Detective Reeves speaking with Captain Franks about the situation. It's the same MO that they've been dealing with for the past 3 months. All 3 of these men have had their spines broken, but apparently they're not receiving any medical attention, as this guy is just laid out on the street, paralyzed from the waist down, and they're not certain what to do. They don't seem to be any closer to finding the guy who's done this, and they have no real leads other than just getting the same description from all of his victims. And on the next page, we see Shadowhawk observing the scene, still covered in the blood of the guys that he beat up. And he's really proud of himself and reveling in the fact that he has done some real damage to these guys who, while in all honesty, were up to no good, but it does seem pretty extreme that he's gone to such lengths to injure them in such a permanent manner. And we also see that he is narrating his own inner monologue throughout the entirety of this comic. He has no actual dialogue. He never actually speaks to any of the other characters throughout the entirety of this book, but he does consider himself to be a nightmare walking. Satisfied that his work on this scene is done, Shadowhawk decides to move to another part of the city, and this is where we start to get a glimpse into how he views the work that he is doing, as he states that no matter whether or not these criminals get off on some sort of a technicality or if they wind up serving time in prison, the outcome will be that they will forever be prisoners in their own bodies for as long as they live, which is a really, really dark tone to have at the beginning of this comic. It really makes it feel that Shadowhawk lies somewhere on the vigilante scale between Batman and the Punisher. He's not killing anybody, but he is doing irreversible damage to them that they will never recover from. And it's an odd place to be. Like, I appreciate what Jim Valentino did here in giving his character a uniqueness on the way he straddles the line between judge, jury, and executioner. We now see that the paramedics have finally arrived to take away all the guys who are now paralyzed. And while Detective Reeves is trying to collect evidence and wants to keep going with the case, the captain tells him that he has to get to Harlem because there is, quote unquote, another fire happening. And Reeves is not happy about this, but the captain doesn't care and tells him to get his partner Jax out of the bottom of the bottle that he's in so that he can join him. I also find it interesting that there's apparently an absolute alcoholic working on the police force that they don't seem to care is an alcoholic. They're just letting him go about his job as if nothing's wrong. And on the next page, we see that the fires in Harlem have been started by who is Shadowhawk's very first adversary in this series, Arson, who is absolutely over the top 90s in his appearance. Look at this ridiculous outfit that he's wearing. These insanely oversized flamethrowers. I understand that he does need to be a somewhat intimidating villain for our hero to face off against, but it seems really absurd that this is the gear he would need to just go around the city and start structure fires. As he's going about his business, he happens to notice a small dog, and this is where we find out that Arson is a bit of a dog lover. He decides to try and catch the dog and get him out of harm's way because he would be in big trouble with Wanda if he did not. And I believe Wanda is in reference to Wanda Blake, aka the widow of Al Simmons, who we know as Spawn. As a crowd gathers on the street and observes the building that's going up in flames, we see a conversation between two men, Hojo and Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul is a former district attorney, and Hojo claims that he was a former Wall Street broker, but he is now a crackhead. And Mr. Paul seems to be very, I don't want to say condemning of Hojo, but you can tell he's not happy about the fact that Hojo is dealing with this addiction and he wants him to get clean. They go back and forth about, the ethics of what they're dealing with. Mr. Paul seems to really be kind of coming down on Hojo about the life he's leading and the people he's hurting, which is strange that this is the conversation they're having, despite the fact that they're both watching a multi-story building just completely ablaze from the street. Here in the top left-hand corner of the next page, we see that the way Arson has been able to escape detection by the authorities is by disguising himself as a New York firefighter after every fire he starts. We then go back to the street level and see that Hojo and Mr. Paul are still having their discussion. Mr. Paul says that the drug habit that Hojo has, and the things that he's doing to feed that habit are bad for him and for society at large. Hojo says that this is really all just a matter of perception and that he considers himself to be filling the needs of what people want, and supplying his own habit has no ill consequences. We see Hojo walking past a store, and in the window of that store, there's a TV on with a news report about Youngblood. You can see Shaft pictured on the TV right there. On the next page, we are transported to Washington Heights, where we see an elderly woman walking home at night, and she's having an inner monologue thinking about how the neighborhood she lives in and has lived in for many years has gone really south in the last several decades. And she raised her children here, one of whom was killed by a stray bullet in the neighborhood. And she blames it on the drugs that have entered the neighborhood and happens across a drug deal going on. This, of course, enrages her, and she tells the men involved that she doesn't want them selling crack on her streets in her neighborhood. One of the dealers tells her to scram, and she quickly hits him across the face with an umbrella, which is awesome. And he doesn't take kindly to that and tells her that she's going to pay for doing something like that to him. Thankfully for the old woman, Shadowhawk was very close by and happened to overhear the entire situation, so he quickly leaps into action, catching the first thug in the face with a swift kick, and then hitting the next one with his forearm-mounted grappling gun, which I should have pointed out earlier but didn't. I actually like that he has the forearm-mounted grapple gun rather than something like what Batman has, where it's a grapple gun that he has to hold on to and store in his utility belt. He continues to fight the thugs, one of which pulls a gun on him. Shadowhawk believes that the guy is just bluffing, but he was not. Thankfully for Shadowhawk, he wears an armored chest plate and an armored helmet. It's very comic booky that this is all just made out of metal, seeing as how something like this would be far too heavy for anyone to wear and would not bend and flex like this. And it also has the negative consequence of ricocheting bullets as they hit it, which is why real life body armor is not just made out of solid sheets of steel. They instead use composite materials to absorb the impact and break up the bullet so that it doesn't do something like that. As a reward for his decision to try and stand up to Shadowhawk, the gunman receives a swift kick to the face, which most likely shatters his jaw or his nose or possibly both. Unfortunately for Shadowhawk, the NYPD was patrolling this particular part of Washington Heights and has come across this brutal scene. They, of course, realize that the man in the outfit is who they've been looking for the past 3 months, that's been going around just breaking the spines of criminals all over town, and get out of their squad car, guns drawn. This is the worst possible scenario for Shadowhawk, who's been trying to avoid a direct confrontation with the police department, as he knows that they will try and prevent him from his one-man waged war on crime in New York, and he also doesn't want to do anything to hurt any of the officers. However, this scene is interrupted by another scene taking place in another part of town at a newspaper office. Which newspaper, you might wonder? That's a good question. I don't know. It's not explained in this book. We see a discussion here between Jamie Antonetti and her boss, Ted, who are arguing because Jamie heard over the police scanner about the call-in on Shadowhawk, and she wants to go down and get photos of him and report on the scene. But Ted says they've been instructed by the mayor's office to steer clear. Jamie's, of course, upset by this and says that this is a direct violation of the First Amendment, which, to her credit, it is. But Ted argues that the mayor's office does a lot of things to help them out. She rebuttals with saying that they do that same thing for the Times and also the Bugle, which I'm assuming is in reference to the Daily Bugle, but I could be wrong. And Ted says, yes, they're laying low as well. This, of course, does not deter her in any way. She says that she wants to go down there. He then makes a vague threat to her job and career going forward, which angers her even further, and she storms out of his office, slamming the door behind her. On the next page, we are introduced to another quote-unquote villain of Shadowhawks, one Miss Bold. That's right, her last name is Bold, but it's spelled with 2 Ds. She is looking out over the city. We realize through her inner monologue that she is the one who has been employing arson to go around and burn buildings in the city, more impoverished parts of the city, so that she can then go in with her development company and build new, more expensive buildings in their place to turn a profit. If you've ever watched the first season of Daredevil on Netflix, you might note that the Kingpin had a very similar plan going on in that season of that show as well. And we see that the next page is all blue. And there's a reason for that. It's because this is another coupon and mail-away form to get Image Comics number 0. If you'd like a detailed and in-depth explanation of the way that this scam worked, check out my video on Youngblood number 0, where I really break down exactly how dumb this was. We see on the next page that Miss Bold is not happy about arson showing up at her offices. Of course she wouldn't be, because she doesn't want the authorities to be able to connect the two of them together in case he ever does get caught. And he says that he's just stopping by for a friendly visit and tries to kiss her hand. She quickly rejects him and smacks him for doing so. But as he leaves, he happens to call her by another name. That name being Vendetta, which I don't remember how that plays into the story, and we don't find out in this issue, so we'll have to keep reading other issues. She, of course, is really, really angry about him showing up and is angry about his insubordinance and the fact that he's directly disobeying her order to never appear at her offices. On the next page, we are transported back to Washington Heights, where Shadowhawk is begrudgingly engaging the police. He quickly pulls out a shuriken that he throws and knocks the guns out of the hands of 2 of the officers with, and then it comes back to him like a boomerang, which seems unlikely, but it's okay, it's a comic book, these things happen. Unfortunately, the last police officer has a rifle. This is bad for Shadowhawk because while his costume is bulletproof, it's apparently only bulletproof to smaller caliber rounds, and he is in a real danger of being shot by a high-powered rifle. On the bottom here, we see that Detective Reeves has shown up on scene, and he is ready to catch Shadowhawk, who has just jumped inside of the closest building to try and get away. He tells the officers to set up a perimeter and that they're not going to let him get away this time. However, Detective Reeves is then interrupted by the quick and abrupt arrival of his partner, Detective Jax. He asks Jax where he was at. Jax tells him it's none of his business. And then the two of them receive a call from the captain, who wants a report on what's going on and also informs him that there's been another explosion in Harlem on a subway track. This explosion, of course, was a bomb planted by arson. And then we're teleported back to the offices of Miss Bold. And we also find out that Miss Bold is the owner of the newspaper that Jamie works for. She is in Miss Bold's office to complain about the fact that the newspaper is suppressing the news and not allowing her to report on the story and get down and take photos of the Shadowhawk, or as they call him, the Spine Buster. Miss Bold then acts very strange and starts to be very kind to Jamie, tells her to sit down, starts to rub her shoulders and tell her all about what's happening. We're then transported back to the rooftop of the building that Shadowhawk escaped into, and we see him crouched looking down at the police below. And then we see this 2-page vertical shot that Jim Valentino decided to draw 30 years ago so he could mock me in the video that I was going to make about this comic and put on YouTube. Thanks a lot, Jim. But in all seriousness, it is a really cool image of Shadowhawk using his grappling gun to jump off the side of the building that he was on and swing through the city skylines, searching out his next wrongdoer, criminal, what have you, in his war on crime. And we see here that in the next issue, he'll be having his showdown with none other than Arson. On the next page, we once again see the PSA telling you to check out your local comic book store that the early Image Comics were so fond of. And after that, we get an advertisement for Infinity. I don't really recall this character, and I can't remember if she ever got her own ongoing independent book. It says in this advertisement that she'll be appearing in the pages of Youngblood, Shadowhawk, Brigade, and Supreme, which I'll have to go through some of those books to see if she shows up. And if she does have her own book, I guess it is possible that I might have it buried in one of my long boxes somewhere. I'll have to take a look. Next, we have a 2-page ad for The Others, which is a comic book that I don't remember at all. I literally have no recollection of any of these characters or this book. I mean, maybe it's possible I have it somewhere, but I don't believe I do. And I am probably better off for it because this looks awful. I mean, nothing about this seems like it's going to be a good book. It's all over the place. We have guard spelled with 2 Ds. Apparently Valentino was really a big fan of using 2 Ds to end a word. We then have contact, whose name is spelled with a K for some reason. We have racket. I guess she might have sound-based powers. We then have clone, which is also spelled with a K for some reason. He's some sort of insect guy, I guess. And then we also have Rebound, who's a dinosaur or dragon man. I don't know. I don't understand this book. It doesn't look good. I mean, Contact's guns are absurd. Guard's weapon makes no sense. It's a mace on one side and a poleaxe on the other. This book is just got all the makings of a hot mess, and if I ever come across it, I guess I'll probably do a video about it, but I'm not looking forward to it. Here on the next page, we get an advertisement for Brigade and Youngblood, and also an advertisement for Pit. I had forgotten that Shadowhawk released before Pit, but, you know, this is probably one of the earliest ads for the Pit comic book, which is pretty cool. Here on the next page, we get an advertisement for Wetworks, which, for some reason, I had a false memory in my head that Wetworks was created by Jim Lee, when it was clearly not. It was created by Willis Portacio, and I really feel bad about getting that wrong. I was almost certain that Jim Lee was the creator of Wetworks, and it was probably because Wetworks was part of the Wildstorm universe. But still, I feel really bad in thinking that for so long and not giving credit to Willis Portacio, which is who deserves the credit for this book. And we'll get around to reviewing Wetworks on the channel at some point. But, you know, once again, Willis Portacio, not Jim Lee. On the next page, we see the first image that Jim Valentino ever drew of Shadowhawk. It's said on the bottom that you should note that the shoulder pads are slightly different in the original version than they were in the finished version. But other than that, it does appear that the costume is basically identical to what the final version was. Here on the last page of the book, we see yet another advertisement for Wizard Magazine, issue number 14. And at this point, I'm pretty convinced that there may not have been a single first issue of an Image comic that released in 1992 that did not contain an advertisement for Wizard magazine in some form or another. On the reverse inside cover, we see the letter section for Shadowhawk, which is titled Out of the Shadows. Now, because this letter section already has its own title, there's no contest to come up with a name for this section. However, Jim Valentino decided that a better contest would be to guess who the secret identity of Shadowhawk was. Now, you might be thinking that this doesn't sound that difficult because you could just write random character names in and cross your fingers and hope for the best that you were the first one to get the right answer. However, Jim had a pretty cool solution for this. What he states here is that in your guess, you also have to submit how you came to this conclusion, what clues you used to come to the conclusion, where those clues appeared on, specific pages of specific issues, and, basically almost an essay of why you chose the character you did as Shadowhawk's secret identity. Now, he does point out that there are nowhere near enough clues to come up with that answer in this first issue, and that if you try to submit before the second issue is released, that your submission will be rejected. Now, you may think that that's a lot of work to go to, just come up with who the secret identity of Shadowhawk is. However, the prize for doing it correctly is actually pretty cool. You get an actual piece of artwork from Shadowhawk #1 signed by Jim Valentino, which is a super cool prize. I know that Shadowhawk is not necessarily the most popular character or book, and that these books aren't exactly worth a ton of money. But if you're a fan of the early days of Image and Shadowhawk and Jim Valentino, that would have been a really, really awesome prize to have, an actual piece of artwork from this book signed by the creator. Again, I wish I had, been around at the time and been involved in reading these books to have entered these contests. Not that I would have necessarily won, but I would have at least had a chance instead of looking back at it 30 years later thinking, oh man, if only. And that was Shadowhawk #1. And I've got to say, not having read this book for a while, I was really shocked to go back and realize just how dark of a book and a character Shadowhawk was. The fact that he just has no remorse whatsoever for the way he enacts justice, and the fact that he almost seems to revel in the idea that he is permanently paralyzing people that he sees as criminals, even if their offenses weren't necessarily, worthy of capital punishment or long stays of prison. He's really hell-bent on just making sure that anyone who's committing, or even thinking about committing a violent crime should be, forced to live the rest of their life as a paraplegic. It's pretty hardcore, man. Like, that was a really dark tone for the time, which I guess is kind of indicative for a lot of the themes that many books had at that time. But man, it was kind of shocking to go back and look at. Well, if you like today's video and you'd like to see more, please feel free to subscribe, comment on this video, give me a thumbs up if you really enjoyed it. And otherwise, thanks for watching. Have a nice day.